Thank you, Hannah. And thank you for inviting me to just say a few words at the end. And it's a kind of humbling experience to do that, having heard such a lot of wisdom being shared already. So it's really just a bit of perspective. And the title was about the future, but I have to kind of come from the past. And I think the past is probably important to remind the early career people particularly about, just as context. So I realized that I started in autism research, I started my PhD in 1988, and the whole conception of autism and the autism research world was completely different. So back in 1988, autism was still thought of as rare, so the incidence that was being talked about was 6 in 10,000. We thought that there were probably up to 10 times as many males as females with autism, and really all the research was about children. So it wasn't just that you expected autism to be first diagnosed in childhood, but that you really people were only focused on children. The idea then was that epilepsy was very common. Well, that's still the case, but intellectual disability was thought to be present for most people, most autistic people. But now, 30 years later, things have changed a lot. So we now think of autism as really quite common, 1% of individuals. The latest findings suggest there are probably, even among diagnosed individuals, only 3 times as many males as females, and that's even putting aside the big question about whether we diagnose and recognize autism correctly in females. I think we're beginning to realize that we have to have a lifelong perspective, even though things like aging with autism are really neglected topics, but people are recognizing that often autism is diagnosed first in adulthood. We still know there's a big comorbidity with epilepsy, but the proportion of people who have additional intellectual disability among all those autistic individuals we now are involved in research and involved in the conversation is much, much lower. On the other hand, we know that anxiety, for example, and depression are major problems for the majority of autistic people, and that those really should be a big focus for our research. So to remind you of what the autism diagnosis used to look like in the 80s, because I looked back at this recently and I was really shocked to see what the description of, even called infantile autism back then. And this was the diagnostic criteria that existed until the early to mid-90s. So note that to have an autism diagnosis, you had to have gross deficits in language development, but also pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people. Can you imagine if that was the criterion for autism now, how many individuals on the autism spectrum would not receive a diagnosis or recognition? Well, we were trying to see the world from the autistic perspective, and at that point, one of the first books that I read about autism when I was still a student was The Siege, which was written by Clara Claiborne Park about her daughter, Jessie, with autism. But around that time, there was only one autobiography, and that was Temple Grandin's book, Emergence Labeled Autistic. I got my first-hand experience as a PhD student. I worked at Sybil Elgar School. Well, I helped. I was a free pair of hands when they wanted once a week through the first year of my PhD at Sybil Elgar School. This young man had a big influence on me because he was in the class that I helped with. And Lorna Wing had a big influence on me. And Uta not only sent me into autism schools, but she also sent me around to talk to people with autism and people who knew autism, like Lorna, whose daughter had autism. So we were trying to see the world through an autistic perspective, but with really old-fashioned views from this perspective now. Now, there was a huge explosion in autism research. In 1988, in that year, there were 180 papers written on autism, and the total publications were less than 2,600. So my feeling then, my naive view as a PhD student, that if I got all the papers that had been written about autism out on a big table, then I was really going to make some sort of big breakthrough and really understand what was going on. At least I had read all the papers. You could read all the papers. Now it would be impossible. There are more than 5,000 papers published each year. almost 60,000 papers in total on autism. So one of the things that happened was that starting in the 90s, I think, and particularly in the States, new charities were formed, and this is these are the founders of Autism Speaks in the States, who Bill and Suzanne Wright, whose grandson has autism, and they wanted to bring new scientists into the autism field who hadn't worked on autism before. And a number of other big funders, big donors, who were typically parents or grandparents with autistic children or grandchildren, wanted to bring new scientists into autism. And this did something new to the field, which was that up until then, I think most of us working in the area really wanted to understand autism. And we were motivated to work on autism because we wanted to understand autism. But now there were lots of people coming into the field who saw there was money here to understand whatever aspect of neural development, genetics, whatever it was, sensory processing in general, and that autism was a way into that. So a very different group of people whose primary interest wasn't autism, but came into autism research. And I'm not saying that lots of them didn't do really good things, but it was a different culture and a different background. And I think from that, those new charities that often campaigned around a way of talking about autism that was really completely unacceptable, parallels with cancer, talk about cure, and so on. And of course, quite rightly, the autism rights movement grew up alongside that, very much countering that kind of dialogue. Participatory research now I see as absolutely essential. So Hannah asked me to try and give an example of some of what we're doing. One of the most recent projects we have is around the different experience and manifestation of autism in women and girls. And because the vast majority of autism research to date has actually systematically excluded women and girls, we wanted to make sure that we weren't starting from the literature that was actually male biased, and we wanted to start with the questions that were more likely to be genuinely relevant to this section of the population. So Vicky and Emma and Holly got together focus groups, and where people preferred one-to-one interviews with autistic women and girls and with the mothers of very young autistic girls, and used a qualitative approach to gather different kinds of information, and this was incredibly valuable. I won't go through all the themes that emerged, but lots of themes about trying to fit in negative impact, other people's perspective of autism, ways of dealing with autism, obstacles, and positive aspects. Lots of aspects that wouldn't have come out of just our reading the existing literature, wouldn't have come out unless we had had absolutely a collaboration with these women and girls on the autism spectrum, and also family members. So it's clear that research partnerships are really vital at every stage in the research cycle. So if you start with what's known, and as I say, in some areas what's known is not very good, and we know we start with biased literature, but you start with literature, you start with personal experience, clinical anecdote, the entirety of what's already out there, and try and generate theory and testable hypotheses. So what's out there includes, of course, the wisdom of autistic people and engaging mentors and collaborators, and then to generate together testable hypotheses and theories, testable hypotheses about things that matter to the autistic community, and then developing tasks that are appropriate to test those hypotheses and getting ethical approval. Clearly, again, consultation, collaboration with autistic people is incredibly important. To make the science as good as it can be and as relevant as it can be. And then recruiting participants, making sure that that's a fair process and a wide process, how to administer those tasks, how to collect data in a respectful and collaborative way, analysing data, but then interpreting results. I think that's a stage at which sometimes we forget again to involve autistic collaborators, because statistics are an art, and it's not straightforward that your data tells you what it tells you. There is interpretation, and it's important to involve autistic collaborators at that stage, as well as in disseminating findings and engaging in two-way dissemination and conversation to go back to contributing to what's known. So 2 more slides, some challenges. there is inertia, and it's been commented that particularly PIs and older, more established researchers like me are slower to learn things and slower to keep up with new trends. And I'm afraid that we do rely on early career researchers to shake us up, to remind us what's new and what's important. There's a challenge that's come up already about how to include the whole spectrum in research partnership. And I think that's incredibly important, and it is a real challenge and something that we need to continue to keep really in centre stage. There's a challenge that sometimes families and self-advocates may have rather different priorities for research or different perspectives on how research should be done. And also that all of us speak as individuals as well as members of different cultural and neurodiverse groups, and we all bring to the table our individual perspectives and our histories. And that's true for the researchers, whether they're neurodiverse, whether they're neurotypical, and we have to respect that, but also have an open ear. And then future directions. I've already said early career scientists and autism advocates need to kindly but firmly re-educate people like me. I think open access research data and publications are really essential. Communicating those in ways that are clear and transparent and not tied up in scientific jargon is important. I think research training for autistic partners in research who want that. I think finding out what partners in research would like by way of training. We've already talked about that. Cos mentioned that collaborative exchange, and I think Damien did too, where the consultant, the autistic consultant, is also finding out more about the research process. And then how to facilitate autistic advisory and research partnership roles, and I'm really glad that Autistica is taking that forward in a really active way. So I think that that's all I wanted to say. It's been a privilege to be here and to learn from all of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing the general questions and comments. And I'd like to thank Hannah and Laura for all the hard work that they've done in putting today together.